Today, we're really diving deep into something that I think is incredibly relevant to all of us, and that's how we learn about technology.
Hmm.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at how one really unconventional teacher is kind of shaking things up in the world of computing education.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating about this particular story is that this isn't someone who's coming from like the usual background. It really makes you question what makes someone qualified to teach, especially in a field like technology that's constantly changing so rapidly.
Exactly, and that's what's so interesting about this article we're looking at. It's called Who Should Teach Our Children Computing? A Very Different View by a guy named John Goodyear.
Okay.
And he's been teaching computing to primary school kids for years, and he's not your typical teacher. He doesn't even have a traditional teaching degree.
That's so interesting because he's coming at it from a place of experience
Yeah.
than like real world, business, IT, web design, all of that practical stuff.
Yeah, it's almost like he's saying, look, I've been in the trenches, and this is what these kids actually need to know.
Exactly.
And, he makes this great analogy in the article. He compares it to, like, having specialized coaches for things like sports or music. Like, you wouldn't expect just the general gym teacher to coach your kids', championship soccer team.
Right. You want someone who has that deep expertise in that area, someone to really nurture that talent.
Exactly.
Give them the best guidance.
And he's saying we need to be applying that same logic to like finding and supporting people with real world tech expertise to actually teach in schools.
Yeah. And to support them once they're there, too. Right? Like to make sure
Yeah.
that they have what they need to be successful.
Absolutely. And the best part is he's not just talking about this theoretically, this guy, John Goodyear. He's been putting these ideas into practice for over a decade. He was pushing for things like cloud-based learning environments back in 2010.
Wow. Which is, I mean, that's incredible when you think about it, because 2010, most schools were still trying to figure out like how to manage a computer lab.
Right.
And he was already thinking about Google Classroom, kids collaborating online.
It's like he was looking into a crystal ball or something.
Totally, yeah.
And he was even organizing these things called Google Showcases to actually show other educators, like, look at what you can do with these tools.
Which brings up, I think, a really crucial point that he raises in the article, this idea of the digital divide. Because he noticed a pattern in who was attending these Google Showcases. It was mostly private and independent schools that were already, kind of ahead of the game, whereas state schools were largely absent.
And that early gap in adopting technology, especially when it comes to things like cloud platforms, that became glaringly obvious when the pandemic hit.
Oh, absolutely. It was like someone flipped a switch and suddenly schools had to pivot to remote learning overnight. And a lot of them were completely caught off guard, even if they technically had, links to virtual learning environments on their website.
It's like having a fancy sports car parked in the garage, but you never actually learned how to drive it.
Exactly. You might own it, but are you really utilizing it to its full potential?
Okay, so it's not enough to just have the technology you have to actually know how to use it effectively, and that seems to be a huge part of what John Goodyear is advocating for. And that's what's so interesting, right? Because he's saying it's not just about constantly upgrading to the latest IT system, having the fastest internet speeds.
Right. It's not just about the hardware.
Exactly. It's about something.
It's got to be something more fundamental, right? Like a shift in thinking almost.
Yes. And he actually uses this great phrase in the article. He says it's like schools are always moving up but never moving forward.
Oh, I like that.
Isn't that good?
Yeah, that's really good because it's that difference between just having access to technology and actually using it to transform how you learn and how you teach.
Totally. And I think this is where Goody's personal story becomes even more relevant because he talks about how despite not having that formal teaching degree, he's actually been incredibly successful in teaching computing to hundreds of kids.
And he attributes a lot of that to his background,
Yeah.
right? To those real-world experiences that he brings into the classroom.
So it's not just about standing up there and reciting facts from a textbook.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
He's got that practical experience, the passion for technology, and even, his failures.
Which I'm sure the kids love hearing about.
Oh, absolutely, because it makes it so much more relatable.
Totally. And he talks about how he was introducing kids to concepts like AI years before it became kind of a mainstream topic in education.
Which is amazing. I mean, how do you even begin to teach something like AI in a primary school setting?
I know. It's like, what does that even look like? I'm so curious.
Well, he gives us one example of letting kids experiment with AI-powered music creation tools.
Oh.
And what he found was that it wasn't just about the technology itself, but it was how it unlocked this creativity in them.
That's amazing.
that traditional music lessons just weren't doing.
So it's like using technology as a tool to empower them to explore and experiment.
Exactly, and to express themselves in new ways, right?
Totally. And that really highlights this idea that, effective teaching, it's not just about transferring information. It's about sparking that curiosity, encouraging experimentation, creating an environment where these kids feel empowered to actually learn and grow.
It's about giving them the tools and then stepping back and letting them run with it.
Exactly. And it seems like Goodyear has really cracked the code, so to speak.
He's found a way to make it work.
He has, but this is where things take kind of a surprising turn in the article.
Yeah,
So
totally.
he's talking about all these successes he's having, and then he drops this little bombshell. He says that despite his clear passion and his effectiveness as a teacher, he's essentially unemployable in the traditional education system.
Wow.
I know it's kind of a mic drop moment.
It really makes you think.
It does.
Because here's someone who's clearly making a difference, inspiring these students getting results. But because he doesn't fit that traditional mold,
He doesn't have the piece of paper.
right, he doesn't have that certificate.
Exactly. So it makes you wonder if someone like Goodyear, with all of his experience and passion, is considered unemployable by the system, then what does that say about how we define expertise in general?
That's a really good question. I mean, are we as a society sometimes too focused on credentials and qualifications rather than actual skills and passion and, the ability to make a real impact?
It's like we're so busy checking boxes that we forget to actually look at the person behind the resume.
Exactly. And I wonder how many other people are out there like Goodyear who have so much to offer, but they're being overlooked because they don't have that one right piece of paper.
And it makes you wonder, are we missing out on all this untapped potential? Because we're so focused on finding people who fit this very specific mold.
Yeah, it's like we're prioritizing the recipe over the actual taste of the dish.
Yeah. I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So are we doing that in other areas of life too? Are we too quick to dismiss someone's experience or insights because they didn't go to the right school or they don't have a fancy title?
It's definitely something to think about. But, going back to Goodyear's story, it really highlights this need to rethink how we define what it means to be an expert, especially in a field like technology that's constantly changing.
Yeah, where the skills that you need today might be totally obsolete tomorrow.
Exactly. So how do we create an education system that can actually keep up with that pace of change?
Right. It's like we're trying to hit a moving target.
Well, I think Goodyear's story gives us a few clues. One is the importance of valuing real-world experience and practical skills, not just formal qualifications.
Right, like those specialized coaches we were talking about. You want someone who's actually been in the trenches, who knows what it takes to succeed in the real world.
Exactly. And I think another takeaway here is the importance of embracing innovation, right?
Yeah.
Being open to new ways of doing things.
Which is something that Goodyear embodies completely. I mean, he was advocating for cloud-based learning environments back when most people thought the cloud was just a fluffy thing in the sky.
And that willingness to experiment, to challenge the status quo, that's so important if we want to create an education system that's actually preparing students for the future.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into John Goodyear's very unconventional journey, I think the big question I'm left with is, what if we started viewing education less like this rigid structure and more like a dynamic ecosystem?
An ecosystem that embraces diversity and welcomes fresh perspectives and encourages constant learning and adaptation from both students and educators.
Because at the end of the day, the goal is to ignite that spark of curiosity in learners of all ages and empower them to thrive in a world that's constantly changing.
And, we might just find that some of those inspiring and effective guides on that journey are the ones who forged their own path, who've dared to look beyond those traditional classroom walls and embrace a different view.
I love that. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive for today.